Well, I think I was the bearer of bad news for many of my audience in the sense of the messaging was the US is not doing well. In one of those conversations, I even tell that maybe that's not the space for the US to be able to compete. One should be able to measure its own strengths and weaknesses and to know where not to start a battle. And that battle might not be the one that US can win when it comes to critical minerals, especially when they try to counter China.
And, we also asked some people, what would successfully countering China look like? If tomorrow they've now fully countered China, what would that Africa-US relationship look like? There was not a lot of specificity, particularly in the last question.
It's interesting because this year, the tone was very different than in past years. During the Trump years, there was this urgency to confront China. And during the early Biden years, there was this idea that says, okay, we're back in the game again. We're now really going to be able to confront China in Africa. And this time, in so many of the conversations we had across the board, from diplomats to policymakers to scholars and analysts, there was a sense almost of resignation that people know that they can't catch up to the Chinese anymore in Africa. They know that. There's an admission of it. That's not something I would have heard 3 or 4 years ago. And now they're trying to find ways that they can compete to their strengths and they can play more to U.S. strengths.
The China in Africa podcast is brought to you in partnership with the Africa-China Reporting Project at Wits University in Johannesburg. The ACRP promotes balanced, considered reporting on China-Africa relations through training programs held throughout the year. More information at africachinareporting.com.
Hello and welcome to another edition of the China in Africa podcast, a proud member of the Sinica Podcast Network. I'm Eric Olander, coming to you again today from Washington, D.C., and as always, I'm joined by CGSP's Africa editor Géraud Nima and CGSP's managing editor Cobus van Staden, also with me in Washington, D.C. A very good afternoon to both of you.
Good afternoon.
Good afternoon.
Gentlemen, we are at the end of a nearly 2-week odyssey here in the U.S. Capitol, where we've spent 10 days meeting with scholars, analysts, civil society activists, and a lot of diplomats from around the world to find out what is going on in the U.S.-China-Africa relationship, what's the pulse here. We do this every year. It was great to have you guys with me this year just to kind of, meet everybody and hear what they have to say. Géraud, this was your first time actually not only just in Washington, but also in the United States. As you look back on these past 2 weeks, talking about China-Africa and U.S.-China-Africa relations, what's your feeling right now?
I think it's a bit of divided feeling overall. When I look at the trip, when I look at the United States, when I look at the people we've met, people we've talked to, and the conversation that we had, is a very quite mixed feeling about what discussions happen here in this town, how policy making happens in DC, and how decisions are made, and how topics are discussed, and what's the views of different stakeholders, being policymakers, being think tanks, being individuals. It's really quite interesting. And all of that in the context of a very interesting social divide here in the United States, in DC, social, racial, political divide in all of that. So all of that somehow kind of spilled out into the foreign policy that the US is implementing overseas in Africa or with China. So yeah, it's very quite interesting feeling, I'd say. It's still something I'm still trying to process, to kind of understand. Yeah,
it's a lot to take. I mean, you have to understand, everyone, that we did 2 to 3 meetings a day, actually, some lasting 2 hours each. And so by the end of the day, your head is just spinning with all of these ideas, listening to what people have to say. And by the way, I do want to express a huge gratitude to everybody who took the time to meet with us and to share ideas with us and to welcome us into their spaces for what was just some fascinating conversations. Cobus, before I get to you, I just want to go back to what Géraud said. Géraud, you said you're of two minds here. On the one hand, you're ambivalent about what you've heard. On the other hand, there was some optimism. Can you be a little specific about some of the pros and cons of what you heard over the past 2 weeks?
I'm still on the fence about optimism because the feeling I had after those conversations, like it's a feeling of lack of clarity when it comes to U.S. foreign policy in a relation with China or any other power. So when just taking that into account, I'm not really feeling optimistic. I'm feeling like much more doubtful about what to expect really for what the United States can really offer, can put on the table in terms of concrete options for Africa to engage with. And a feeling also of an observer really to try to see how things are going to change, especially in this year of election, and how I saw the social divide here, especially here in Washington, D.C., which is much more, I'd say, Democrat-leaning, if I'd say that. So to see where the policies are designed, how it's going really to influence U.S. foreign policy in the next coming years or months, if we follow the polls and if we take the polls for truth to see how Donald Trump might become president. So all of that is really part of that feeling I get, and the optimism is not really one of them. I'm gonna be leaving Washington with a sense of, I'd say, much more doubt into how much we can really not trust, but how much we can really rely on U.S. foreign policy when it comes to an effective and fruitful engagement with Africa.
Okay, Cobus Géraud is leaving with some doubts. What was your impression of the past 2 weeks? And again, when we look at Washington, this was not your first time here. You've been here before. What were your takeaways from what you saw? And again, we can broaden this beyond just the policy, but also to the United States, life in Washington, some of the things that you saw as we walked around.
I certainly came away with a feeling of complexity. This was a particularly unhinged moment to be here because we were in Washington during the assassination attempt on President Donald Trump. And in the conversations, there's this eerie kind of like double feeling where on the one hand, one is speaking with very many smart people about the US and they're expressing a lot of doubts there, a lot of anxiety, a lot of people talking about the future of democracy. But then outside, everything's very eerily calm, so it's just kind of guys in golf shirts zipping around on electric scooters outside, So everyone's going about their day, but at the same time, it's these big historical things being discussed. So that itself is very interesting. And then in relation to all of the conversations on China and Africa, on the one hand, it was fascinating to talk to people because there's such smart people here and they're working on such interesting things, so there's all of these really inspiring and possibly amazing kind of plans for different kind of development initiatives and, commercial engagement and so on. And at the same time, one also gets a feeling that it's very, very hard for Africa to get on the agenda at all in DC, and that there's a whole set of kind of structural barriers kind of hemming in the way that, particularly outside of the bubble of people who specifically focus on Africa more broadly in DC, there is a feeling that it's very difficult for Africa to be on the agenda at all. And then when it is on the agenda, it happens within very specific fields. So there isn't a wide-ranging discussion necessarily about the continent here. And in some ways, kind of like the discussion about China is similarly both ever present, but also kind of very specifically hemmed in by within certain kind of assumptions. So it's a very much a mixed bag, but there's certainly a lot of very interesting conversations to be had.
Talking about the assassination attempt, that's something really kind of struck me because the day after that, I went circulating in Washington, D.C. around the White House and everything. It's just like nothing happened. It was like normal day, people doing their business, visiting and people laughing. I really that was quite strange for me coming from sub-Saharan Africa where any kind of big event like that would the next day turn into really something serious. You can really feel that on the street with people when you talk to. But here it was like normal day, like nothing happened, but it was a big thing. That was quite surprising to me.
It did happen far away from here, and so I think that a lot of people probably said, well, there's no impact here in Washington, what's happening. Cobus, let's go back to what you were saying in terms of getting Africa on the agenda. What was so interesting is that many of the people who we spoke with are very passionate, very dedicated about Africa issues, yet they struggle to get some of those issues onto the agenda because things like the war in Ukraine, the South China Sea, the war in Gaza, and there's also a sense that Africa just isn't that strategically important for the White House and for Congress, except in the context of security, critical minerals, and China. Those were three things that came up repeatedly throughout the discussions that made Africa relevant. And in many of the conversations we had, people would say, listen, I'm emphasizing things like security or even the dreaded words debt trap, wink, wink, nod, nod. I know it's not true, but I'm putting it into my plan or my paper or my proposal because that's how I get traction in this town. Talk to us a little bit about that, Cobus.
Yes, there's certainly a feeling that, like both in relation to China and critical minerals, but also just more broadly, that Africa is largely seen as a set of problems. And like those problems tend to slide down on the scale of importance and or slide up it, if there's an external factor involved. And particularly in this case, it happens to be critical minerals and China, the combination of critical minerals and China. Like in one of the briefings, we were discussing what US foreign policy priorities are in Africa. And one of the people we spoke to said, well, kind of one of the big things is essentially to make sure that the problems that are in Africa, and he was mentioning particularly kind of like issues like health issues, like disease issues and terrorism, that they don't grow bigger in Africa, and particularly that they also stay in Africa. And I think that is maybe revealing of the place that the continent occupies. It's not necessarily a pressing problem, but a potential future problem. And that future problem aspect of it gets heightened when one is talking about critical minerals and one is talking about China. That said, I have to say at the same time that many of the people that we spoke to were also very engaged with very creative and interesting kind of possible development initiatives and kind of travel back and forth to Africa many, many times. Like people we spoke to have been in like Nigeria like 5 times this year, for example. So it's certainly not true for everyone. Like there's like people who are focused on Africa are really focused on Africa. But I think it's more broadly, it's, kind of the continent gets a little flattened in the way that it's seen.
Well, Géraud, Cobus brought up the issue of critical minerals. You were very popular at a lot of the discussions we had, given the fact that you have this fantastic expertise in China-Africa mining issues. People were very keen about what is happening in this space. Let's talk about some of the discussions that we had related to critical minerals. What were some of the concerns that you heard and some of the thematics that you can share?
The concern that I've heard during this conversation, it was much more, first of all, to grasp and to grapple what's the situation of China's presence today in that space in many African countries, what to expect, how much they're advancing in that critical space with African countries, how much they're responding to the demand of African countries when it comes to processing and refining of critical minerals, and how the US can be present. Is there a space for the US to be able to move around that space? And if there is, what can they do? The concern was also like where the US, even when you remove China out of the equation, is there a space for the US to be present in that space of critical minerals in terms of processing, in terms of extraction, in terms of refining, all of that. But most of concern also remain like how good the US is doing so far since it starts talking about decoupling from China, countering China in the critical minerals, how good the US is doing on the ground. Those have been some of the topics that came quite often during those discussion when it comes to critical minerals, where people really wanted to know.
When that issue came up of how well is the United States doing, what did you tell them?
Well, I think I was the bearer of bad news for many of my audience in the sense of the messaging was the US is not doing well. In one of those conversations, I even tell that maybe that's not the space for the US to be able to compete. One should be able to measure its own strengths and weaknesses and to know where not to start a battle. And that battle might not be the one that US can win when it comes to critical minerals, especially when they try to counter China, because we kind of review the strengths and the weaknesses that the US can have in that space, and we didn't see much of like serious comparative advantage allowing them to be a competitor. Because when you talk about competitions, we need to have actor on the ground. But when you look the map of critical minerals in Africa, different countries and different actors, there's no space, there's no US presence there. We even mentioned the case of the DRC after the tension that we had for the last 3-4 years around DRC and cobalt and Chinese company, where when you came here last year, remember the town was buzzing about how much China maybe is losing its traction in the DRC. But I was coming here bearing the bad news by saying, China is very much present. They're expanding their presence. They're even increasing the output. So the US, all those buzz really led to nothing. So I think I was the bearer of bad news in that regard. So yes, my answer to that was like, there is a really good much effort to do, but maybe they should not be focusing on critical minerals anymore and finding in other spaces where they can really be present or competitive.
The way that you're defining the U.S. is purely the U.S., but you know that in the space of critical minerals, they count Canada, UK, and Australia as domestic minerals. So that is, if something is sourced from an Australian company, that is counted as a domestic U.S. source for minerals because it's cleaned and improved and it's not related to China, assuming it's not related to China. And so when we look at what the U.S. is doing in the critical mineral space, if you take into account Canadian, UK, and Australian mining companies, then there's a very different story that's there. And the U.S. is providing an architecture like the Mineral Security Partnership that those other countries are operating within. So maybe the U.S. position is not about Freeport-McMoRan, a U.S. company going to the Congo to mine cobalt, but creating an architecture for its allies like Australia, the UK, and Canada to do that.
But even that space, the reality is, I think I've mentioned it, and I don't think I mentioned it here, but in other conversation, I even wrote about it, that you have Australian company moving away from that space in Africa. You have Australian company selling the lithium project to Chinese. For example, we've been talking about how China has been investing in lithium in Zimbabwe and building concentrator for spodumene. But those projects, three out of four of them were bought from the Australian company. When you go to Namibia, we see the same thing where Australians are selling the asset to Chinese. So even that space, even when we remove the US as individual country, we take US allies, we see the same trend happening. Yes, we can mention Glencore, Swiss company in the DRC. Yeah, that was before we start talking about challenging China, that Glencore was there already. But once we get into that timeline where it was about countering China, we don't see much of improvement, much of action taking. And mind you, we're only talking about sub-Saharan Africa, southern of Africa. But if we go up to Morocco, I don't need to remind those who are listening to us that a few months back, we talked about this Canadian company that decided to leave its headquarters in Toronto to set shop in another country just to allow it to get financing from Chinese company. So even into that space, when you look into into Africa, you still realize that even going through the allies, there's still a lot of things, there's still a lot of weaknesses they have to overcome.
I mentioned at the beginning of the show, this is probably my fourth or fifth year of coming every summer to do these tours and to have these conversations. And Cobus, it's interesting because this year, the tone was very different than in past years. During the Trump years, there was this urgency to confront China. And during the early Biden years, there was this idea that says, okay, we're back in the game again. We're now really going to be able to confront China in Africa. And this time, in so many of the conversations we had across the board, from diplomats to policymakers to scholars and analysts, there was a sense almost of resignation that people know that they can't catch up to the Chinese anymore in Africa. They know that. There's an admission of it. That's not something I would have heard 3 or 4 years ago. And now they're trying to find ways that they can compete to their strengths and they can play more to U.S. strengths. That was a lot of the conversations we had is, what can the U.S. do that's not in direct competition? Because as Géraud pointed out, we're not going to be able to see the Americans go head to head with mining in the Congo. No matter how much people want that to be the case, it's not going to happen. But there was almost this lamenting that, yeah, the Chinese, we're not going to catch up to them. Did you hear that as well?
You know, to a certain extent, I didn't have the kind of frame to be able to compare it to earlier times. For me, it sounded less elegiac, maybe, you know, a little less sad, in the sense that, you know, the feeling I got is in some cases there was an acknowledgement that the horse race aspect of it, the directly competing with China aspect of it, is itself becoming part of the problem. You know, and that for the US, so this isn't necessarily, you know, a defeat for the US. It's more an acknowledgement that for what they want to achieve in Africa, you know, kind of like making it all as part of an anti-China project is not productive, particularly in their dealings with the Africans.
And we have to give credit to Judd Devermont, who back when he was the National Security Director for Africa, shifted the policy away from the horse race with China. That was really part of the Biden strategy a couple of years ago.
Yes, absolutely. And I think, you know, to my mind, that's a wise strategy. I guess, you know, kind of what struck me was, you know, we asked several people what the US themselves would like to achieve in Africa outside of the countering China thing and outside of the critical mineral conversation. And, you know, kind of we also asked some people what would successfully countering China look like? You know, if tomorrow they've now fully counter China, what would that Africa-US relationship look like? There was not a lot of specificity, particularly in the last question. Like in more broadly, obviously there's a lot of talk about wanting to promote democracy in Africa, wanting better health outcomes in Africa, wanting better development in Africa. But there's a little bit less kind of clarity in how specifically that connects to the US. Unlike, for example, as far as I know, the conversations about, moving forward with US priorities in Latin America, for example, that has a direct bearing on the US, kind of that it directly relates to US futures. There's less of that in Africa, and maybe that's not surprising because Africa is far away and, and the US isn't like stuck to Africa permanently the way Europe is. But at the same time, there wasn't really there didn't seem to be that much of a kind of a clear, kind of grasping or like grappling with how African priorities overlap with some key US priorities. It was more that all of these successes in Africa would be good for the world more broadly, which it would be. But kind of if you're going to be spending billions of dollars of US taxpayer money on them, then then some direct connection to the US would be helpful. And there sometimes it felt like the two kind of drifted apart a little bit.
We don't want to make it sound like it was so grim, because there was a lot of optimism, and it was optimism about the possibilities of what the United States can do in Africa, not necessarily to compete directly with the Chinese, but we heard some fantastic ideas about the United States leaning into its educational strengths, for example, to create U.S. university campuses in Africa. Given that it's so difficult for Africans to get visas to come to the United States, why not build the campuses that they have in places like Shanghai, Qatar, the Emirates, and build them in places like Ghana? And that was really exciting. We also heard a lot about some of the logistics and the transportation initiatives that they're doing, specifically around the Lobito Corridor, which is not just a whack China over the head type of initiative, but also a lot of economic development initiatives going on there. A lot of optimism that came up in a number of our conversations about that. So, Géraud, let's kind of maybe lighten up the conversation a little bit and talk about some of the more positive aspects of what you heard in some of the themes in our discussions with folks.
Yes, it was really interesting to have those perspectives. And this is something that we cannot deny to the people who we've met, in the sense of there is still that willingness to really be present in Africa, to try to do something, to make things going in a certain direction, to be really able to have an impact, whether being from a US security perspective or whether being under the umbrella of development. But there is still that need to say that we want to be present. And this is something that, yes, that can be taken as positive, in a sense that despite all the reality on the ground, despite all the narrative about the geopolitics, but there is still that need of creating development, that need of impacting, empowering communities, building solar power plants, connecting Africa, allowing farmers to become much more independent, to create environment for entrepreneurship to flourish and everything. So yeah, there is still that sense in many and some of the people that we've met that to believe that the US can still do something. And I think for me, the need will be to really tailor that approach in a sense that they can really have that positive impact, so they can still remain really much relevant to many African countries beyond the spectrum of national security, beyond the spectrum of humanitarianism that Africa has been, that permanent humanitarian crisis, but become that partner that can engage Africa in a much more broader perspective rather than being reactive on situation on the ground. So yes, there is a lot of positivism that we can perceive in many people that we've met, that still the US can do something and be something in Africa. And first of all, let's not forget it's the first great power in the world, so they still have tools in their hands to really have positive impact in many African countries.
One other topic that was almost every day, it felt like, came up was the issue of the African Growth and Opportunity Act. That's called AGOA. That's effectively the free trade agreement between the United States and a number of African countries. And Cobus, this was a hot topic for you because South Africa is the bulk of AGOA, and there's some legislation making its way through the United States Congress where a lot of people, particularly on the right here, are not happy with South Africa, but also it came up in the context of Uganda and how the United States withdrew its AGOA privileges for Uganda because of Uganda's anti-LGBTQ plus policies. And so that was a lot of discussion about whether or not it was wise of the Biden administration to weaponize AGOA for non-economic means and non-economic reasons. Talk to us a little bit about the AGOA conversations that came up, again, over the course of the entire 2 weeks.
So the African Growth and Opportunity Act is coming up for review next year. So I think that's one of the reasons why it's in being discussed so much. So both the cases of South Africa and Uganda are raising questions about how the act should be used. Like what its kind of utility is, not outside of its, trying to increase trade. One of the things we should keep in mind about AGOA is that it increased imports from Africa to the US quite rapidly until it didn't. So imports from Africa have fallen back down to roughly pre-AGOA levels. And the number of countries, even though most African countries have access to it, the number of African countries who actually are able to exporting under AGOA are quite few. And the bulk of AGOA trade is made up by South Africa. So the issue of whether South Africa should be in AGOA or not, has direct bearing on whether AGOA makes sense to still exist or not. So that's a complicated set of questions. Like in relation to how it's been used, I think a lot of people, I was raising the complication of the AGOA as an example of the complications of the way that Western power, is wielded in the world. So Uganda got expelled from AGOA because they instituted a really draconian anti-LGBT law, which is now leading to massive homophobia in Uganda. So like a noted LGBT activist got stabbed this week in Uganda as part of a hate crime that was partly kind of, in the context of this kind of inflamed, kind of anti-LGBT hatred in Uganda. So this is extremely worrying. I find it extremely worrying, particularly as an LGBT person myself. And I, have very little sympathy for the Museveni government for pushing through this nonsense legislation. At the same time, what we had to point out was, in the first place, by Uganda losing AGOA privileges, many Ugandans lost their jobs. And this is now within Uganda being weaponized against the LGBT community. So the Museveni government, they are directly blaming the gays for now having cost Uganda this trade privilege. But at the same time, the anti-LGBT legislation that came in was very deeply informed by, and to a certain level written by, American evangelical activists who have been active in Uganda for years. And everyone knows this. The United States knows it, the Ugandans know it. So the anti-LGBT law was created as a certain vector of Western power and US power, and now Uganda has been kicked out of trade privileges by another vector of US power. So this is not good for the LGBT community in Uganda, and it's not really good for anyone, I think. So this is an example of how complicated the situation is. There's also the, two separate bills being talked about South Africa, particularly about reviewing the relationship between the US and South Africa, and, kind of possibly cracking down on South Africa, around perceptions that South Africa is too close to Russia, and around still the fallout from allegations by the US ambassador in South Africa that South Africa had possibly transferred arms to Russia during the visit of a Russian ship to South Africa. On the South African side, that incident has been investigated, and it was shown that no such arms transfer had happened. Yet the conversation is, in Washington is still very much around, like as if that investigation never happened. So many of the people we spoke to said, look, this is probably not going to go forward, and even if it does go forward, it doesn't kick South Africa out of AGOA. It simply calls for an annual review of the relationship, which will probably, each time that review is done, the recommendation will probably be no, South Africa should stay in AGOA, not least because there's about 600 US companies working in South Africa, and South Africa is the only kind of AGOA success story. But still, kind of even if that review comes through, it still adds a stress on the relationship. It's something South Africa has to deal with periodically. It still puts South Africa in the dog box, in this kind of symbolic way that the South Africans bristle against, and that will in the long term end up sweetening the political climate for China in South Africa. So these are both really complicated examples of how AGOA is functioning or not functioning in Africa. And one of the things that it made very clear is that if you are simply interested in increasing trade between Africa and the US, AGOA isn't cutting it.
Yeah, and it's interesting because these conversations came at the same time that China has just appointed one of its top diplomats to South Africa in a move that will no doubt strengthen the relationship between South Africa and China. So it's interesting, the contrast between the strains between the U.S.-South Africa relationship and the arrival of Wu Peng, who's the former Director General of African Affairs in the Foreign Ministry and now the ambassador to Pretoria. So an interesting contrast.
Yes, it's really interesting all this timing, because it shows how much, for example, in the case of Wu Peng being appointed in South Africa, it really revealed how much South Africa remains important to China. During this trip, we've mentioned FOCAC, we mentioned BRICS, we talked about how much South Africa was absent during the BRI summit last year, and seeing Wu Peng being appointed as ambassador to South Africa is a sign that China, though was not really happy about the absence of Cyril Ramaphosa in Beijing last year, still consider South Africa as a very important partner for China on the continent. So yes, in all that context, when you take the tension with the US and how South Africa can navigate that's I think something that really stuck me, in the sense where I'm quite curious about how South African diplomacy, especially now with the GNU government, they're going to navigate all the tension with the US and with China, and how they're going to position themselves, because they remain a very important country in Africa, top first economic power in the continent, first industrial countries on the continent, member of the G20. South Africa is not a small country; it's a very important country, and yes, the ability of its diplomacy to be able to navigate the tension with different powers is something very crucial to its future. So yes, we'll see if there is a new administration in Washington, how they're going to deal with that situation of South Africa and how they're going to move forward with that. But I'm quite curious to see much more on the South African side, the dexterity of its diplomacy.
Let's close our show looking forward. Towards the end of our stay in the second week, a lot of conversations came up about Donald Trump, in part because after the assassination attempt, there really was a sense that in some ways it's over, the election, that Biden's poll numbers have not gone up, the Trumps have surged, the Republican National Convention took place this week, lots of momentum for the former president, and there's just a sense that this is what it's going to be next year. It's going to be the Trump administration. Of course, we don't know that for sure, and nobody knows that for sure, but as we look forward, and this came up in a number of our conversations, how do you think the United States will respond to Africa and engage Africa in a second Trump administration? Géraud, let's go to you, and Cobus, then I'll give you the last word.
The sense that we got in many of the conversations that we had was the sense of unknown first, because unknown, since Donald Trump is perceived to be unpredictable, it had that element of surprise that we don't know really where we are going, where we're going to move forward with Donald Trump at the helm of the United States with its Africa foreign policy. Are we going to go in a space where Africa is going to be at the bottom of the agenda, or are we going to be in a space where Africa becomes somehow important under the context of a geopolitical tension with China? And this is the two feelings that we got on different discussions that we had. And of course, from an African perspective, there was this worriness that are we going to see what kind of US policy are we going to see there? But personally, on my views, I think I've shared that in a number of times. Under Donald Trump, if the US comes to kind of retrench from Africa, for me, I think it won't be so much of a bad news for Africa, because I do believe that it's always a good news when great powers like the US, I think I also said that here before, when a great power like the US kind of retrench from Africa, it always gives space for the continents to be able to dictate, not to dictate the term, that to create a space for itself in terms of diplomacy on the international stage, in terms of getting his voice heard on different arena. But it's going to depend on different African countries to really seize the momentum momentum. Because for me, an absent US policy in Africa is not ultimately the bad news. It's not ultimately a sign of like a catastrophe is going to come. It can be, and I even feel there's much more of a potential of an opportunity more than a risk. So yes, that's really much the feeling that I got from the idea of Donald Trump being back in the White House. And it's really interesting. I'm really quite curious to see how it's going to move forward with him as president, if that ever happened.
Several people on different occasions mentioned that the Republicans tend to focus more on security. That's something we know, more than diplomacy and development. So under a second Trump administration, the State Department is going to be severely downgraded, likely, in many parts many reasons why, because the Trump administration in the first time, and what we've seen in Project 2025, which is the conservative blueprint, is that they regard a lot of people in the State Department as part of the deep state. They're also going to, de-emphasize a lot of the strategies coming out of think tanks. And as Géraud pointed out, it's going to be a lot more erratic decision-making, which is typical of what Trump did in his first administration. So, Cobus, as you look forward to next year and what we heard based on some of and it wasn't all anxiety. Some people were just kind of very matter-of-fact about it, that if Trump comes back, what Africa policy would look like. What did you hear?
One of the things that stood out, I think, is that the current alliance building that has been really surged very strongly under President Biden may become a little bit more complicated. I think particularly kind of US cooperation with Europe will become more complicated. And what we're then looking at is, in the first place, a kind of, different Western powers acting less in concert. And that will then probably also, kind of accelerate a certain level of multipolarity, I think. So if the US and Europe are not acting together, then Africa will deal with the US and Europe as two separate spheres. And they are, of course, to a certain extent already, but, they may be much less on the same page than they were before. This is happening not only in the context of the rise of China and a renewed prominence of Russia in Africa, but also, as we're seeing a growing prominence for several other emerging powers in Africa as well. So, Turkey, the United Arab Emirates, India, Iran, and so forth. Kind of like all of these, all are becoming bigger players in Africa. All of them have a different interesting sets of agendas in Africa and offer certain opportunities. So if one is also seeing at the same time more isolationism in the US, if one is seeing less buy-in in the idea that the US should be a global development driver, and one is also seeing the erosion of all of this deep knowledge and deep capacity in that the DC ecosystem offers via think tanks and via the State Department. If the State Department, for example, is weakened, or many of those technocrats are replaced by MAGA loyalists, then one sees the US losing a lot of its grip on what is happening in Africa, and at the same time ideologically also caring a lot less. So that kind of divides the US and Africa further, and it probably then opens a space for a lot of other actors to become more prominent there. The question, I think, is, so that's happening on the diplomatic side. That is probably not going to happen on the security, because, as you say, the Republicans tend to be more focused on security, and the Pentagon will probably have an even stronger voice. I mean, the Pentagon always has a very strong voice, but it will have probably an even stronger voice, under Trump. So, so the danger there is that there is a securitization of the US-Africa relationship, which is already, to my mind, over-securitized. And that is possibly a complicating factor there. The other question is how much African leaders will be able to get done. There's still a lot of investment, there's a lot of connections between the US and Africa. Whether the stepping away of some of these kind of like machines of the state from Africa, whether that will be replaced by, say, diaspora capital, that's an open question. But kind of what I think in the short term, what it will probably mean is that Africa will have to pivot to particularly eastwards, not only to China but also to the Middle East and to the Indian Ocean rim and to the Indo-Pacific, and that there will probably be less kind of political and other kinds of engagement on the Atlantic side. But that's a lot of conjecture.
Okay. Well, gentlemen, thank you very much for an exciting past 2 weeks and joining me on this adventure in Washington, D.C. I hope you both have very smooth trips, long trips. 28 hours, I think, Géraud, is the flight from Mauritius to Washington. So, oh my Lord, that's a long trip. But I hope you have safe trips back to Mauritius and to South Africa. If everybody at home would like to find out more about some of the takeaways that we had from this trip, we've each written some reflections that are available on our site at ChinaGlobalSouth.com. It's available to our subscribers, and it's because of our subscribers and the support from our Patreon supporters as well that we can do all of this. And we are so grateful to be able to do this, but we do need your support. Go to ChinaGlobalSouth.com/subscribe. Subscriptions are very affordable, and you get a fantastic daily brief in your email inbox every morning at 6 a.m. Washington time. And so if you want to follow everything that's going on in China, Africa, China, Asia, Latin America, the Middle East, and the rest of the Global South, then this is just an excellent resource. And I can tell you, a lot of people here in Washington read and listen and follow, and so we're very grateful to that. So if you want to see what they're seeing, then go to ChinaGlobalSouth.com to sign up. So once again, for Cobus Géraud, I'm Eric Olander. Thank you so much for listening. All of us will be back again next week from Asia and Africa for another edition of the China Africa podcast. Thank you so much for listening. Until then, we'll see you next time.
The discussion continues online. Tag us on Twitter at ChinaGS Project and visit us at ChinaGlobalSouth.com. If you speak French, check out our full coverage at projetafriquechine.com and AfriqueChine on Twitter. That's Afrique with a K. And you'll also find links to our sites and social media channels in Arabic.